Hi Year 12. In this lecture we're looking at why girls seem to be doing so well in education. Apologies, I've got a bit of a cold, so my voice doesn't quite sound its usual self. First question I'd like you to consider is, why is it that girls underachieved until the 1980s? And in particular, what tended to happen around about the 1980s and possibly the late 1970s that gradually led to girls overtaking boys in achievement in school? If you aren't sure what the answers might be, please have a look in your textbook. If you look between pages 125 to 129, there are plenty of ideas that might help you explain why girls underachieved until the 1980s. That's what I'm looking for. Why did they not do so well? So until the 1990s, girls achieved less than boys at school. Okay, they studied very different subjects and they got lower paid and lower status jobs. Okay, in terms of the subjects, what types of subjects do you think they typically did before the 1990s? Okay, so think about typically female and masculine subjects. Because women typically got lower paid and lower status jobs, this affected how hard girls might try at school. Okay, what's the point in studying really hard to get an A star in science, maths and English if you're only going to go on and be a secretary? Okay, so this could also explain why girls didn't do so well beforehand. What attitudes towards girls' education do you think this reflected by parents and teachers? Okay, so think about the attitudes of parents and teachers and what impact do you think that had on girls' experiences of education? Okay, there are a number of sociological explanations as to why girls underachieved. Stanworth argued that girls suffered from low expectations by the teachers, parents, and the girls themselves. Teachers did not believe that girls were of equal ability as boys. There was a general consensus or agreement that girls weren't necessarily as capable in highly stressful environments that required management and what have you. Parents, let's face it, parents around about the 1990s, okay, they probably would have been had their primary socialisation around about the 1960s, maybe even the 1950s, you never know. So as a result, their ideas about what girls and boys typically would achieve would have been vastly different to ours today. And many parents would not have expected girls to go on into quite senior management roles that paid very well. Okay, so as such, careers for girls were not thought of as important. Careers were very much something that girls had on a temporary basis before they got pregnant, and then they would become full-time mums, or if they did return to the workplace, they would only work part-time. Glenys Loban did a study of textbooks, and she argued that textbooks across primary schools in particular either ignored girls or showed them as inferior. So if you look at science textbooks, you would typically have male scientists conducting experiments, okay? And within the reading books, they tended to portray the gender stereotypes. So the female characters were very much more interested in playing with dolls or being rescued by Prince Charming, whereas the male characters were very much more about being adventurous, competitive, or even heroic. Dale Spender argued that teachers actually paid less attention to girls. She did a non-participant observation study of teachers and students in the classroom environment, and she argued that teachers tended to spend more time engaging with and dealing with boys, okay, and paid less attention to girls overall. So as a result, any girls that might be doing particularly well didn't necessarily benefit from the halo effect that we know seems to be more prevalent today. So what I'd like you to consider, have any of these changed and in what ways? So think about the lower expectations of girls. Are careers for girls not thought of as important? Do you think textbooks are still sexist? And do teachers pay less attention to girls? Have any of these things changed in your opinion, and in what ways? If you could annotate that onto your PowerPoint. When writing an essay about the difference in achievement according to gender, it is worth mentioning the previous argument that girls didn't used to do as well in schools. Nowadays, however, we have what's known as an increase in girls' achievement, an increase to such an extent that they have now surpassed boys at most key stage levels. There are a number of explanations why. When we consider home background, very much the cultural background of girls has changed in a sense that their parents' expectations have adjusted. Girls that are socialised in today's society are predominantly being socialised by parents who have maybe gone through the second wave of feminism and appreciate that girls' careers are now valuable and that girls can be considered equal or almost equal earners in the household. So parents now expect their female children to do just as well at school and possibly in the workplace as well. Most explanations centre around what's going on in school and what's changed. Arguably, there are higher expectations now of girls, okay? And to the extent that Howard Becker would argue that expectations of girls are actually now surpassing that of boys. There's also increased awareness of gender issues in schools. For example, the government has introduced policies like WISE, and if you can Google the WISE campaign and annotate on your PowerPoint, what is this and why is this a good example of positive discrimination in schools to benefit girls? The sociologist that points to the awareness of gender issues in schools is Bowler. There have also been significant changes in the curriculum. Weiner argues that textbooks these days tend to present women with much more positive images, and they seem to appear much more frequently in typically masculine subject textbooks like science again. Okay. Weiner also argued that teachers are starting to challenge such stereotypes of girls being inferior to men. Finally, Roger Slee argues that boys are seen as liabilities, okay, because of marketisation, whereby schools are now compared based on the numbers of A stars to C's they get, including English and maths. Because boys are less good at English, they're less likely to be included in that 5 A stars to C bracket. So as a result, Roger Slee argues that boys are seen as liabilities, particularly for exclusion. Jackson, however, argues that girls have benefited from the marketisation reform, as girls are much more valuable because they're much more likely to do well in both maths and English. It is worth noting here, by the way, thinking about Roger Slee's argument, that boys being seen as liabilities for exclusion, if a school has a high exclusion rate, it can trigger an Ofsted inspection, and if exclusions are too high, it can lead to a school failing its Ofsted. As with social class and differential achievement, it's worth considering what's going on outside of school and outside of the home in wider society. When talking about gender, you can't ignore the impact of feminism. So through the 1960s, we had, like I said, the second wave of feminism, and this led to a range of changes for women, okay? The traditional stereotype of a woman's role has certainly been challenged. They're no longer viewed as just housewives. Women have opportunities in the workplace in the sense of equal pay. There's far more jobs and careers for girls, and they are more likely to get higher status jobs, and that's now considered significantly normal. As you can see from the image here, you've got a woman firefighter, which is becoming more typical. We have more women in the police force, and we have more female lawyers and doctors in the profession now than men in the UK. So this is a significant change from the 1980s and before. It is worth noting at this point that while liberal feminists are really happy with the gradual changing and attitudes towards women and equal opportunities, radical feminists are still really critical with the fact that we still have a pay gap, there are still significant gender stereotypes associated with different careers, and that many women still seem to hit a glass ceiling when trying to apply for the higher status jobs. So that's worth noting as an AO2 point. Hopefully you all remember Sue Sharp, her study, Just Like a Girl. She conducted research in the 1970s and then asked the same questions again of girls in the 1990s. This is known as a longitudinal study because it was done over such a long period of time. She tested how girls saw their futures, and she used what's known as unstructured interviews. What I'd like you to do is look at page 127 for the pros and cons of this research method, which is a longitudinal study using unstructured interviews. And can you remind yourself about what did she find out about the changes in girls' attitudes when you compare the 1970s to the 1990s? More recent research tells us that these attitudes have continued to change. If we look at the research of Angela McCrory, she conducted content analysis of magazines and soap operas. Now, if you look at page 126, you can check what she found out. Can you please tell me, does her findings support what Sue Sharp found out for the same period, which also compared the 1970s with the 1990s? If you look at these two magazine covers, one from Jackie from the 1970s and another from Vogue in the 1990s, what messages all seem to be coming across? Okay, what seems to be the most important features of the covers? Angela McCrory argued that these showed that there was a change in attitudes in what women viewed as important. Because let's face it, magazines are only as popular as their readers make them, and readers will only buy magazines that they're interested in reading the stories. So what are the different types of stories that seem to be covered in these two? If I asked you to go out today and look at the magazines in W.H. Smith, I'm just wondering which messages you'd be more familiar with. Would you find covers like the one in front of us of Vogue, talking about Queen Beyonce ruling the world as a strong woman who has made her own fortune and is widely admired and respected by both men and women all around the world? Or do you think the stories of that you can see in the background of Closer might be the ones that seem to come through? Now, if you look at the messages in the different magazine covers, perhaps you can annotate on your PowerPoint what messages or what seems to be most important to women according to these Closer magazine covers when compared with Vogue. And which magazine, honestly, do you think is more popular, the Vogue or Closer? And what does that mean in response to sociologists' arguments that actually women's attitudes have changed and we are now more concerned with being strong, independent women rather than being obsessed with men and our figures and makeup? As I mentioned briefly before, radical feminists are still very critical about the level of progress that's been made in education. They would argue that there are still significant inequalities. They point to, in particular, differences in subject choices. Now, if you look in your textbooks on page 133, you can find a bit more detail around this area. Now, they argue that there are differences in subject choices at national curriculum level, which would be GCSE, at AS and A levels, and also vocational courses. So can you please annotate what types of subjects do you think boys and girls are more or less likely to take at AS and A level? And what vocational courses do you think are more likely to appeal to girls and more likely to appeal to boys? Now, why do you think there's such a big difference in what type of vocational courses boys do and girls do? So again, there are a number of sociologists who argue about why they are different. Okay, Murphy and Elwood point to the importance of socialization, which affects gender identity, behavior, and interests, particularly your primary socialization. Think about the types of toys girls and boys play with and how that might affect their behavior and interests when they're older. particularly maybe things like Barbie dolls and building blocks. What types of interests in careers do you think that encourages? Browne and Ross argue that their ideas about gender, that should say gender domains, apologies for that being squidged out by the picture, they argue about gender domains, and they say that these are shaped by early experiences and parents' expectations. They argue that certain subjects and certain behaviour fits in within a particular gender domain. And if a boy acts outside of his gender domain, he is likely to be labelled negatively by his peers, possibly picked on and called names, accentuating his feminine qualities. Likewise, women girls who might be interested in behaviours or interests outside of their gender domain are also likely to suffer exclusion and name-calling by their peers. So, for example, mending a car or fixing something is seen as something that's part of the male gender domain, whereas looking after someone or helping someone who is hurt is seen as something that's part of the female gender domain. Alison Kelly argued that subjects also have gendered images, and she points to the example of science in particular as being seen as a boy subject. Now, she argued that in science, most of the teachers are male. The examples in the textbook seem to talk about boys more than girls. And when it comes to the practical experiments in science, boys seem to monopolise the equipment and girls tend to stand back and let the boys do all the practical, physical side of the science. Peer pressure is a key factor to consider about why students pick particular subjects. So, for example, boys are unlikely to pick subjects like dance and possibly even art because they're viewed as feminine, and girls may not consider subjects like construction or tech because they're seen as masculine. There was a study by Alison Dwyer in 1990 that found that male students would call girls lesbian or butch if they appeared to be interested in sport. It is worth thinking about the gendered images associated by women who are involved in many masculine sports, such as rugby and hockey. Okay, is there a stereotype that people seem to hold about the girls that take part in those sorts of sports? And are they, and perhaps you can discuss how they are unfairly assigned. What probably plays the biggest role in why girls pick certain subjects and boys pick other subjects are gendered career opportunities. Boys very rarely take subjects like health and social care or childcare. Generally, this is associated with careers in the care industry, such as childcare or nursing. And as a result, girls are much more are overrepresented within this industry. It's worth considering the fact that there are changes in the economy leaning towards certain caregiving industries taking primacy over the information industry, particularly with the fact that machines are gradually replacing some of the traditionally masculine roles in the economy, like ICT and dealing with figures, whereas there's an argument that women may well benefit out of this change because you can't use a robot to replace the role of a nurse, for example. Now, it is worth having a Google of gendered career opportunities and seeing what you can find out about the differences in the careers that men and women typically go into, despite the fact that we're currently in our 50th or 60th year of the second wave of feminism. There still seems to be vast differences in the types of careers that men and women choose to enter at any stage of their employment. Remember this image? Cellular Solutions, which I think is a southeastern company, posted a picture of all of their staff. Now, if you look at what's the stark difference between the managers and the support team and the sales managers and the senior management, How can you use this very current contemporary example? How can you use this to help you answer a question about the differences between genders and achievement or subject choices? Because it is worth mentioning repeatedly that even though girls seem to outperform boys at all levels of education, they are underrepresented in the most senior management positions around the country. So please annotate on your PowerPoint, how would you use this example from Cellular Solutions in an essay about subject choices or about gender and achievement? Thank you very much.